centres trade their IP to downstream demanders of ideas, product producers and sellers. Now at this point you might be saying, okay, this sounds a bit like I'm at university again. Prove it. Well, that's where I'd start actually, ironically, Hollywood. Because Hollywood's the first example of the innovation economy in action. In the 50s, all of the functions of the innovation of the studio business were integrated within the studio. Development, manufacture, distribution, all managed internally by the studios. By the 80s, this dominance had evolved into a very complex ecosystem. Scriptwriters, producers, actors, all of the different people that come together to make a film would come together in unique configuration for each movie and access a core piece of IP. Now, Chicago is a good example of this. It began life as a manuscript, rapidly went to an out-of-print book, picked up, the rights were purchased, turned into a Broadway film, which became a feature movie, which ultimately spawned merchandising, soundtrack, CBD, and then ends up on my wife's iTunes player. In other words, what we have here is multiple people accessing a core piece of IP, passing it along the value chain and extracting value from it. Second piece of evidence, the emergence of the platform company. In the past, companies would design a product, they manufacture a product, they sell the product. Ford designs an SUV, it manufactures it in Detroit, and it sells it to a dealership in the US. In other words, you produce everywhere and you sell everywhere you're producing. Now, today's companies are asking themselves, you know, the three things that I do, producing is a mug's game. It ties up a lot of capital, it's very expensive, it's labour intensive, it's highly volatile, and it trades at major discounts on exchanges, manufacturing companies typically. Designing and selling are the other two things, and they're high value add, so therefore why wouldn't I outsource my production? And in fact, that's exactly what platform companies do. Design anywhere, i.e. get smart young things in China to design anywhere, actually Brazil, to design my products. I produce nowhere, I outsource that to someone, and I sell everywhere. Dell, Walmart, IKEA, H&M, Procter & Gamble, they're all examples of this. And this, in fact, the innovation economy has been a major driver of outsourcing. It's called the we think they sweat model. Some big company examples. Procter & Gamble, their old approach was we invented, not invented here. Now, Procter & Gamble just about went bankrupt in the late 90s and they were forced to reapproach their entire focus on product development. It was highly successful. From 2000 to 2005, over 50% of Procter & Gamble's products came from external sources, which I think we heard from Brian earlier today. IBM, the old chestnut, they wanted freedom to invent. That's why they originally filed patents. But they changed their strategy in the early 90s and they went from royalties of $5 million to $1.2 billion in 4 years, over that period. Texas Instruments, again, filed patents in '59 to protect semiconductor ideas, and by 1990, Texas Instruments was deriving half of its corporate income from royalties. And finally, we can see it in patent reassignments. In 1980, less than 3,000 US patents were reassigned. By 2003, that had increased to 90,000, and there's now estimated that there's a 25% likelihood that any given patent will be reassigned in its life. And we can also see that in terms of US license revenue dramatically increasing over this period. So, the innovation economy is upon us. The question is, what do I need to do to succeed in this economy? Well, I think it really begins with two realizations. The first is not all the smart people work for you. And again, this is something I think Brian picked up on earlier this morning. The vast majority of the most valuable ideas in your industries are going to be created outside your organization. And what that means is that we need to encourage internal access to external technologies. I bring in IP from smart people outside the organization, break down the castle walls that Brian showed us. Secondly, you can't use all your smart ideas. Even with the absolute best R&D processes in the world, you can't possibly productize all your best ideas. And that being the case, you need to allow external access to internally developed technologies, release IP to the outside to be used by smart people outside. So, not all the smart people work for me. It means bring ideas in from the outside to tap into a global pool of new ideas and technologies, that 22% of the highly gifted and genius folk inside of China. It lowers the cost of innovation. It reduces development time and increases speed to market. It reduces and spreads risk. And it provides access, allows you to access new product and market opportunities. The classic case is something, some work that our company did with Fonterra. We licensed them a new technology that's enabled them to put the same product, yogurt, into a different form of packaging and increase their margins 3 times. And they're selling exactly the same yogurt. It's just in a different form of packaging, and it cost them less to make. And that was a technology that Fonterra admitted themselves would not have likely have been developed internally. It also, I think this is a really important point, it avoids you being blindsided by disruptive technologies. Now, this is one of my favorite quotes from this world. Many of our stockholders have asked me about this new invention by Alexander Graham Bell called the telephone. Well, we think it's an interesting curiosity. There's never going to be a market for that technology, and therefore we have declined an offer to take a license. This is the chairman of Western Union in the late 1800s, and we know what happened next. And one of the reasons for that is that large companies like Western Union aren't very good at grasping innovation and turning it into reality, as we saw from the Iceman example. There are so many vested interests, but the problem is they need to, because if they commit themselves to a Ricardian growth path, the problem is that there is this other type of growth out there called Schumpeterian growth, which Brian mentioned. And Schumpeterian growth is growth generated from innovation in technology and entrepreneurship, and it produces radical increases in value. If I can find my pointer. Radical increases in value by new products, new markets, and processes. It's spontaneous, it's revolutionary, and most importantly, it's disruptive, because when Schumpeterian growth occurs, Ricardian growth typically does this. This is all those chaps hauling ice out of the ponds outside of Boston. And this is your refrigerator. So that second principle, you can't use all of your smart ideas. Releasing ideas to the outside enables others to utilize IP, and it thereby enables you to capture more value. It multiplies your revenue opportunities, and it increases R&D efficiency. I mean, one of the things that I find extraordinary is that really we need to begin to think about unused ideas as a waste of corporate resources, and not to mention the fact that it's highly demoralizing for the staff that create them. It generates knowledge about market and technical opportunities you wouldn't otherwise have. And to be honest, bottled up ideas tend to find their way out regardless. I was recently talking with a senior engineer inside one of New Zealand's largest companies, and I said to him, look, what would happen if someone within your team came up with a really clever idea, like a Google type idea? And I'm not kidding, the guy didn't even hesitate. He said straight away they'd resign. That's not a good thing for that company to experience. Procter & Gamble, for example, welcomes competitors adopting technology because they're not striving for better or newer technologies, and instead they become happy followers instead of threatening leaders. So they actively out-license. And we've got some examples here. Over the 90s, 35 different projects left Xerox PARC after funding were canned, and 30 were given free licenses on the basis that Xerox thought there was no value in those ideas. 11 projects succeeded, and the total market capitalization of those projects is now twice that of Xerox PARC. And these are the ideas that Xerox were dumping. January 3, Procter & Gamble had 2 ideas it couldn't do anything with, so it licensed them to its competitor Clorox. There was a JV structure. Clorox got 90%, Procter & Gamble kept its toe in the water for 10, and an option to acquire another 10. 2 years later, literally 2 years later, Procter & Gamble exercises the option for $130 million. These are ideas that they would have otherwise dumped. In fact, Procter & Gamble has a policy that says, it's the 3/5 policy. IP is made externally available 3 years after the product ships or 5 years after the patent issues. Absolutely no excuses. This change in Procter & Gamble's behavior was driven by a recognition that they had to change the way they developed their products in response to the emergence of this economy. So returning to this picture, if we see when we're making losses, what happens with what we call open innovation is that by leveraging external IP, you can significantly lower your development costs and thus reduce your overall costs. Better than that, you can add in multiple layers of new revenues, things like new products, new markets, license revenue from licensing your technology, spin-off or sale or services. So we've dramatically shifted the profit position by opening up to the outside world and accepting that there's an economy out there that is trading in ideas.